Now that we have implemented the iNotify property changed interface in both the user and the post classes, it's time for us to use this implementation to start working in SAML and see how this is going to affect the way our application works. And we can start in the register page, where we currently have an email entry and a password entry, both of which currently have a name because in the code behind we have to access their properties so we can assign the value inside of the text to the email and the password of a new user. But because we have already implemented the interface inside of the user class, we may not need this. So back in the register page.saml, we're going to have to bound the text property of the entries to one of the properties of the user class. One is going to be the email property, and the other one is going to be the password property. So let's learn how to do that. All we have to do is assign the text of the entries to a binding property. And we simply have to write the name of the property. In this case, the first one is going to be email, and for the second one, we're going to be binding to the password. Now you may think, where is this coming from? This doesn't even know about a user class. Well, no, not yet. That's why to the container for these entries, we do have to set a name. This is going to be container stack layout. And what we're going to do is set a binding context to the entire stack layout. So every element inside of this parent is going to have the exact same binding context, which is going to be set to a user. And once the binding context exists, now the entry is going to know from its binding context to use the email property. Now, until now, the only thing that is happening is the model will change the values in the view, but the view won't change the values to the model, because currently the mode is set to one way. It's the default mode, and that one way comes from the object to the properties in the view. So we have to change the mode to be two-way. So also the entries update the binding context. So inside of this text definition, right after setting the binding property, we're going to write mode and we're going to write two-way. And the same for the other entry. After setting password, we have to write mode. Notice that there are three ways. Well, the default is just going to be setting it to one way. And there is one way to source, and two-way, which we have already mentioned. And now to set the binding context. Back in the register page class, what we want to do is define a user object. It's going to be defined as class level object. And I'm going to initialize it inside of the constructor, simply to a new user. And right after this, I want to set the container's binding context. This has to be set to an object, and it's going to be set to user. So now, like I said, the binding context for the entire stack layout is going to be that user. So the entry with the same binding context as the stack layout will access one of the properties of that context and bind the text property to it. And the same for the password entry. Now that we have this, then we don't need to create a new user. We can simply delete the definition of a new user, and I'm going to set a breakpoint in the call for the register method. This variable, the user variable, is now going to be coming from the class level object. And we need the breakpoint to see if indeed this has what we have written inside of the entries. If it does, it means that we have successfully implemented the iNotify property changed interface. So I'm going to test this on one simulator. I do seem to have made some mistakes when changing this to full properties. The latitude, for example, has to be double. The same for the longitude, and the distance has to be an integer. So let me try this again. So here's the application up and running. And I'm going to navigate to the register page. In here, I am going to write something inside of the email address, which is going to be email@example.com. The password is going to be secret, and the confirmed password is going to be the same. So we execute the section of the code that is going to allow us to know if this is being correctly bound. I am going to click on register, we hit the breakpoint, and if we hover over the user object and we expand its properties, we now see that indeed the email and the password have been correctly set to what we write down inside of the entries. So we can be certain that we are correctly binding the properties. Now I'm going to stop the execution and I'm going to do the same with the new travel page. I am going to navigate to the new travel page where I have one entry, which is the entry for the experience of the post. So I'm going to copy the name of this property, the one that I want to bind, and I'm going to set the text of this entry to be binding to the experience property. I'm also going to set a name for the stack layout, which is going to be again container stack layout. Back in the C# file, I am going to create a post object. I am going to initialize it inside of the constructor, and this object is going to be set as the container stack layouts binding context. And inside of the event handler, instead of creating a new post, I am simply going to be accessing the post properties and assigning them to the code that we are currently writing inside of this event handler, which is getting the selected venue, getting the first category from that venue, and then assigning the values to the correct properties. But we do no longer need to set the experience because we're binding that experience. What we do have to do is set the property directly to the post object that we have just created and change the commands that we had for semicolon. And now I want to set a breakpoint in here to take a look at what the post has, because by this line the post should already have the experience set to whatever the user has written inside of the corresponding entry. By the way, another thing before testing is evaluating if the property changed event has subscribers. It turns out that if you fire an event and there aren't any subscribers to an event, firing the event would create an exception because it's sending a notification to no one because there's no event handler. That's what I mean by subscribers to an event. To evaluate this, all we have to do is evaluate before firing the event if the event itself is different than null. If it is, it means that it has subscribers. This same thing we have to add before calling the method from the onPropertyChanged of the post class. And now I will try this one more time. So here is the application up and running, and I am going to log in with the credentials that we have inside of the Azure database. In here I am going to navigate to the new travel page, and I will set some location so we get some information about the places that are close by, and I am going to write some experience. Select one of the elements, click on save, we hit the breakpoint, and if we hover over the post object and we expand it, currently the experience is null, and I think I know why, and that is because we didn't set the mode to be two-way. Indeed, we have to set the mode to be two-way, otherwise the default one-way is only going to be setting the value from the post object to the text of the entry, but not the other way. And I have seemed to made a terrible mistake in here setting the binding context to the container stack layout, which is terribly wrong. I am sorry, I have to set this to post. And now when I try this again, this should work correctly. So here I am back in the new travel page, setting the location. I am going to select one element, write something down in the experience, click on save, and now we hit the breakpoint in the post object. We see that the experience has finally been set. This means that we have correctly implemented the iNotify property changed in the post class as well. So we have talked about the iNotify property changed interface, we have implemented it in a couple of classes, and we're already using this from SAML, so we don't have to access the properties, but set the values seamlessly through data binding. In the next lecture, we're going to start talking about the iCommand interface.